He told her plainly, the moment she stepped off the wagon, that he had not sent for a companion. He had sent for someone capable of work. Fern Lackland set her traveling bag on the frozen Alberta ground, looked at the man who had not come to meet her himself, who had let his ranch hand drive the 2 hours from the Calgary rail station while he stood in the yard with his arms folded against the November cold, and she said, "Then show me where to start." Arthur Grady did not move. He was taller than she had imagined from his brother Malcolm's sparse letters, and quieter than any man she had met in her 27 years in Toronto. He had the kind of face that weather makes, lean set with eyes the color of the sky behind the Rockies just before a Chinook, pale gray and absolutely still. "Kitchen," he said finally. "Supper's overdue." He walked back into the barn before she reached the porch steps. Behind her, the ranch hand named Hector cleared his throat with a sound that was almost an apology. "Don't take it to heart, miss," he said. "He's been like this a good while." Fern did not ask how long. Some silences announced themselves plainly enough without being named. She had read Malcolm Grady's advertisement in the Toronto Daily Star on a Tuesday in late October, sitting in what remained of the Maplewood District schoolhouse. 4 walls, no roof, the smell of char still on everything after the fire that had claimed the building, and her position in a single September night. She had been substituting for 3 years, long enough to know that substitute teachers were the first cut when budgets tightened, and the last considered when new positions opened. The advertisement had been brief. A working ranch in the Alberta foothills needed a capable woman, hard winters, honest pay, a permanent home for the right person. Write to Malcolm Grady, Calgary. She had written back the same afternoon. Not because she expected anything beyond a practical arrangement, but because Toronto, without the school, without her mother 2 years dead, without the apartment she could no longer afford on a teacher's wages, had the quality of a room she'd already been asked to leave. She needed somewhere to go toward, not just somewhere she was being pushed from. The train from Union Station to Calgary had taken 4 days. She had watched the country change through the window, the granite and spruce of Ontario giving way to the flat immensity of the prairies, the sky opening up enormous and indifferent until it felt like something that could swallow a person whole. She had arrived at the Calgary station in the dark with 1 trunk and a carpet bag, and Malcolm Grady had been there to meet her. A shorter, louder version of Arthur, with a salesman's handshake and an expression she spent the entire wagon ride to the foothills trying to read correctly. "Arthur's not much of a talker," Malcolm had said, almost cheerfully, as though this were a charming eccentricity rather than a warning. "But he's decent enough. He needs someone steady, someone who won't be put off by the quiet." "I grew up in a quiet house," Fern said. Malcolm had glanced at her sideways. "Then you'll do fine," he said, and turned his attention back to the road. She had not thought, at the time, to ask why Malcolm had placed the advertisement rather than Arthur himself. The Grady ranch house was larger than she'd expected, and emptier than she could have imagined. Not in the way of a house that had never been filled, but in the way of one that had been full, and was now carefully maintained at a distance from that fact. The furniture was good, a proper parlor table, solid chairs, a cast-iron stove in the kitchen, but it sat in the arrangement of someone who had stopped rearranging. A woman's rocking chair stood beside the cold fireplace with a small woolen blanket folded over its arm, the kind of blanket made for something much smaller than a grown person. A tin of dried wildflowers on the windowsill, the petals gone the color of old paper. Fern put her bag down in the center of the kitchen. She stood very still for a moment. Then she took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and started a fire in the stove. She made a pot of oatmeal and salt pork from the provisions she found in the larder, plain and filling, the kind of supper that asked nothing of the person eating it. When Arthur came in at 6:30, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen for just a moment at the sight of the set table. Something crossed his face and was gone. He sat, he ate. Neither of them spoke until he pushed back his bowl, and then he said, with the careful economy of a man who had gotten out of the habit of conversation, "You managed the stove." "I manage most things I'm shown once," Fern said. He finished his supper without comment. But he finished every bit of it. The first week was an exercise in invisibility. Arthur moved through his own ranch like a man who had made a private decision to need nothing from anyone, and he extended this determination to include her. He gave her a list of duties on the second morning, written in a hand that was blunt and precise, the handwriting of someone who had no interest in being misunderstood, and then he left her to get on with them without asking after her progress or offering guidance. She got on with them, and then she did more. She found that the kitchen garden had been left unprotected against the frost and salvaged what she could before the next freeze. She reorganized the larder into something a person could actually navigate. She found a cracked pane in the back window that had been patched with a board and replaced it with a proper piece of glass she had asked Hector to bring from town, paying for it herself and setting the receipt on the kitchen table without remark. Hector watched all of this with widening eyes. He caught her one afternoon at the woodpile, splitting lengths she had decided not to wait on, and stood there with his mouth open for a full 3 seconds before he took the axe from her hands with the quiet authority of a man who had chosen his battles carefully, and this was one of them. "Most women who come out to this place," he said, stacking the wood she'd already split into the barrow, "last about a month before they start asking about the train schedule." "Is that so?" Fern said pleasantly. "Yes, ma'am." The cold, the distance. He tilted his head in the direction of the barn, where Arthur's voice could be heard giving terse instructions to the cattle. "He doesn't make it easy." "He doesn't pretend it'll be easy," Fern said. "I'd rather that than the other kind." Hector looked at her for a moment, then nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had been on the fence about for some time. The breaking point came on the 9th day, and it came from the account books. She had been working through the ranch ledgers, listed third on Arthur's task sheet after kitchen and mending when she found it. Not fraud, not at first glance. Just numbers that did not quite close. Amounts being drawn from the cattle sale revenues and recorded as management expenses without corresponding receipts or vendor names. The handwriting recording these withdrawals was not Arthur's. She recognized Malcolm's handwriting from the letters that had passed between Calgary and Toronto. She sat with this for a long time before Arthur came in from the south pasture. He stopped when he saw her, at the desk, 3 ledgers spread open, and her notes arranged in the careful columns she had learned, from watching her father run a mercantile that ultimately had not survived his own inattention to such columns. "The accounts," he said, "not a question." "They've been shorted," she said, and turned in her chair to face him directly, because this was not the kind of information that benefited from being approached sideways. "Someone has been drawing against your cattle revenue for the past 18 months. The amounts aren't enormous individually, but they accumulate. You have considerably less operating capital than you think you do." The stillness that came over Arthur Grady was the kind that preceded a decision, not an explosion. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at her. He looked at the handwriting she had marked with a strip of paper and then said, very quietly, "Malcolm." "I can't confirm who physically made the entries," Fern said carefully, "but the handwriting matches his letters." Arthur sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the cold still coming off him from outside, and pulled the ledger toward him and looked at the marked entries for a long time. "He's been trying to get me to sell the ranch for 2 years," Arthur said finally. "The revenue's been lower than it should. I thought the market was soft." He pressed both hands flat on the desk. "I thought the market was soft." "Show me everything," he said, and so she did. It was not the ledgers, in the end, that changed everything. It was what Fern found when she went looking for the source of Malcolm's drawings. She found it in the file box Arthur kept in the back room, business correspondence, mostly, and a copy of the original land deed, and underneath it a document she almost missed. A preliminary sale agreement between Arthur Grady and the Foothills Land Development Company of Calgary, signed and dated 6 weeks ago. Signed in the place reserved for Arthur Grady's name, by Malcolm Grady. She brought it to Arthur that evening, without preface, and set it on the kitchen table between them. She watched his face go through several things. The comprehension, the cold, controlled anger that was not coldness at all but its opposite, something so heated it had gone still. And underneath both, something older and more exhausted. The look of a man who had been waiting for the ground to shift for so long that when it finally did, the feeling was almost familiar. "He doesn't have signing authority," Arthur said. "No," Fern said. "But if the company doesn't know that, if they've already acted on this as a valid agreement, the legal position gets complicated." Arthur looked at her. "You know contract law." I know what my father's contracts looked like before someone else signed them on his behalf, she said. I know what it cost him. Silence, the fire in the stove. What are you suggesting? He said. There's a clause, she said, pointing to the third page of the agreement. Standard in these preliminary agreements. The sale is void if the signatory cannot demonstrate clear title authority. Malcolm can't. But the company needs to be shown that formally, before they act on the agreement and establish facts on the ground. She met his eyes. We need to move first. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding something, not about the contract, about her, whether she was someone he could trust with the weight of what came next. Why are you doing this? He said. This isn't your land. Fern thought about the 4-day train ride west, about what she had been moving toward, even before she had a name for it. Because I came here to be useful, she said, and because I think you've been managing things alone for long enough that you've forgotten you don't have to. Arthur Grady looked at the contract and then at her and then back at the contract and something in his shoulders. Just slightly, just enough, let go. All right, he said, what do we do first? What they did was go to the neighbors. This surprised her. She had expected resistance, the private stubbornness of a man who had kept to himself for 4 years. But Arthur Grady, when he had made a decision, moved on it without hesitation. Within 2 days he had spoken to 3 neighboring ranchers, whose own dealings with the Foothills Land Development Company had left them with questions they had never had reason to ask together. He came home each evening and told her what he had found, sitting across the kitchen table with his hat on the chair beside him, and his coffee going cold while he talked, and she listened and asked questions and kept notes and thought. It was different on those evenings. Not soft, not romantic, but something she found herself returning to in her mind during the days when he was at the pasture and she was at the desk, the quality of being genuinely consulted, the sense that what she thought mattered to the outcome. On the 4th evening, he came home with something new in his face. Bess Thorpe at the next property over, he said, before he had even taken off his coat. Her husband dealt with the same company 2 years ago. She found their escape clause herself and talked him out of signing. He sat down. She wants to come over. When? Fern said. Tomorrow, if you'll have her. Of course, Fern said, and something in how she said it, as though this were already her table to invite people to, made Arthur look at her for a moment before he went to hang up his coat. Bess Thorpe arrived with a covered dish and a 20-year archive of opinions about the Foothills Land Development Company. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had clearly gotten ahead of being underestimated some decades ago and had never looked back. She laid out, in the efficient sequence of someone who had been organizing this information for some time, exactly how the company operated. The federal land commissioner in Calgary is not in their pocket, she said. The territorial judge, 3 counties over is. Go federal, go fast. After Bess left, Arthur stood on the porch for a while in the cold. Fern came and stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Elaine would have liked her, Arthur said. She had learned by now to listen when he mentioned his wife's name. He did it rarely, and each time it cost him something he offered anyway, like a man who had decided that paying the cost was better than the alternative of never saying the name at all. Tell me about her, Fern said. He was quiet for a moment. Then she was from here, born on a ranch 30 miles north. She knew more about cattle than I did when we married, and she never once made me feel it. He paused. She was 24 when she died. The baby came early. There was no doctor near enough. The Rockies were black shapes against a sky full of cold stars. I'm sorry, Fern said, and meant it with the particular directness she had learned was the only decent way to say it, not softening it, not building a fence around it, just letting it be what it was. It was 4 years ago, Arthur said. I tell myself that should make it less. It doesn't work that way, she said. It just changes, the weight shifts. He turned and looked at her. How do you know? My mother, she said. 2 years gone. I still reach for her when something happens I want to tell someone. Arthur exhaled slowly. A long, deliberate breath, the kind a man takes when he has been holding something in a space that was too small for it. That's exactly it, he said. Quiet and certain, the way people speak when they have been handed the precise word for something they thought was private. They went back inside. They made coffee. They talked until midnight about the legal filing and what needed to happen in the morning, and neither of them mentioned what had just passed between them on the porch, because some things need to be left where they fell before you try to pick them up. The filing went in on a Thursday. Malcolm arrived on the Friday with the land company representative, a smooth man from Calgary in a city coat, who had clearly not expected to be met at the door by a woman who had already read his firm's preliminary agreement 3 times and could quote the nullification clause from memory. Fern said, pleasantly and without moving from the doorway. The signing party on that agreement did not have legal authority to bind this property. We have filed with the Federal Land Commissioner. Any further action on your company's part while that filing is active will constitute interference in a federal proceeding. The man from Calgary looked at her. He looked at Arthur standing at her shoulder. He looked at Malcolm, who had the expression of someone arriving at a party to find it was a funeral. They left. Malcolm said his words in the yard before he went, loudly, the words of a man who had believed his plan was solid and was discovering the place where it wasn't. Arthur listened without raising his voice. When Malcolm's words ran out, Arthur said quietly, "You signed my name, Malcolm." The silence that followed had the quality that follows when something true is said simply, and there is nothing equal to say in return. The commissioner's ruling came in the week before Christmas. The agreement was void. The Grady Ranch, the Foothills pasture, the cattle range, the creek rights, the North Quarter, remained Arthur Grady's in full and uncontested. He came through the kitchen door that evening with the letter in his hand and the look on his face of a man who has been braced for a blow for so long that when the blow fails to come, his body does not know what to do with the absence of it. She looked at him from across the kitchen. "It held," he said. "It held," she said. He crossed to her. He stood in front of her and looked at her for a long moment in the way she had come to recognize as Arthur Grady's version of saying something. The look that came before the words that often contained more than the words ever managed to. Then he put one hand on the side of her face, careful and certain, the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. "I registered you on the deed," he said. 2 weeks ago when we filed, your name beside mine." She stared at him. "In case it went badly," he said. "I didn't want you to have nothing if I lost it." He paused, "But that's not the only reason." Her heart was doing something she had no precise language for, something large and quiet and uncontainable, the way the foothills sky was large, not dramatic, but simply enormous, simply true. "Arthur," she said. "I know it's not what either of us had a name for when you stepped off that wagon," he said. His voice was steady, but it cost him, she could see it. "But I want to do this right. I want you here because we both decided it, not because the deed needed a second name." She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "I decided," she said. "I decided the first week, when I found the blanket on the rocking chair and understood what it meant, and stayed anyway." She met his eyes. "I've been waiting for you to catch up." Something moved through his face, not the near smile she had glimpsed once or twice in those first weeks, but something deeper and less defended, the expression of a man who has stopped arguing with his own need. He kissed her, quietly and completely, the way things are done when the person doing them knows exactly what they mean. Outside, the Chinook was coming in off the Rockies, that particular Alberta warmth that arrives in winter without permission and cannot be explained, only accepted, and the temperature was already rising, and the snow was beginning to melt from the eaves. Inside, the fire was going. The rocking chair sat beside the hearth where it had always been, and the small blanket was still folded over its arm, and the tin of dried wildflowers was still on the windowsill. Fern did not move any of it. It was not hers to remove, and it was not his to put away, and the house held it all without contradiction, the past and the present, and the particular stubborn warmth of two people who had come to each other sideways, through ledgers and legal filings and cold porch conversations about grief, and had arrived by that winding route, exactly where they were supposed to be. In the spring, when the ground thawed and the crocuses came up through the mud along the south fence, Arthur asked her again, properly, with words, in the yard in the early morning light with the Rockies pink behind him. And she said yes without hesitation, because she had already decided, and saying it out loud was simply the last honest step in a direction she had been walking, since the day she stepped off a wagon in the Alberta foothills, and a quiet man in a worn coat told her he didn't need a companion. She had known, even then, that he was wrong about that. She had simply waited for him to find it out himself.